Chapter 2 of The Little Girl Next Door. Read by Marie Christian. The Little Girl Next Door by Nina Rhoades. Chapter 2 Joy. When Sarah had appeared so suddenly on the scene and swept Gladys away from the open window, the little blind girl next door had remained standing for a moment, her head still turned in a listening attitude. But at the sound of the maid's sharp voice and the sudden closing of the window, she had drawn back hastily, and having closed her own window, had once more seated herself in the low rocker where Gladys had first seen her. There was a bright color in her cheeks, and for a few moments her happy face was clouded. "I hope she won't be scolded," she said half aloud. "She was so kind, and I did like talking to her so much. I'm glad I haven't any nurse, if that was her nurse who came to the window." She sat quite still for the next 5 minutes, her hands folded in her lap, and the happy, contented look came back into her face. The little clock on the mantel struck 4, and with a joyful exclamation the child sprang to her feet. 4 o'clock, she cried. "Now I can read until Aggie comes home." She walked quickly across the room to the closet. It was quite true, as she had told Gladys. She could find her way about as easily as any seeing person. And taking from the shelf a large, clumsy-looking volume, returned with it to her seat by the window and spread it open on her lap. It was a very odd-looking book indeed, for instead of having printed letters in it, it was filled with queer little dots, all of which represented letters or word signs, and were sufficiently raised from the page as to be easily distinguished by the fingers. The queer, puzzling dot combinations were no mystery to the blind child, and her fingers were soon flying over the embossed page with almost as much ease and rapidity as the eyes of an ordinary child would fly over a page of common print. For some time the little girl read on in happy oblivion to all around her. Sometimes she paused for a moment to smile over something that evidently pleased her, and once or twice she laughed outright. She was roused at last by the sudden opening of a room door, and the sound of a sweet, clear voice saying cheerily, "And what has my little Joy been doing all this wet day by herself?" Down went the big book, and up sprang the child with a cry of delight. Next moment her arms were around the newcomer's neck, and she was kissing her rapturously. "Oh, Aggie, what a lovely surprise! Why, it's only a little after 5. I hadn't even begun to expect you yet. And," passing her hand over her sister's waterproof, "you're not a bit wet. Has it stopped raining?" "No, indeed, but I've had a bit of good luck this afternoon. Mrs. Winthrop's niece came to see her, and when she was leaving, she said she would drive me home in her carriage. Wasn't it good of her? It was very early, but Mrs. Winthrop said I might go." "And you really had a drive all the way home," said Joy, clapping her hands. "And all day I've been thinking of you coming home in one of those horrid cars full of wet people. That just shows how silly it is to worry about things before they happen, doesn't it? Now take off your things and come and sit down. I've got something real interesting to tell you." The elder sister smiled, then glanced rather anxiously about the room. "Any parcel come for me today, Joy?" Joy laughed and clapped her hands again. "No, indeed. I know what you're thinking about, but it won't come back this time. I know it won't." Agnes tried to laugh as she kissed the little eager face, but she stifled a sigh nevertheless. "We won't despair till it does come anyway, will we, dear?" she said. "This publisher has kept it so much longer than any of the others that I am really beginning to hope a little myself." Then she turned away to take off the shabby old waterproof and the hat that was seeing its 3rd year of service. She was sometimes almost glad that Joy could not see how very shabby that hat was growing. Joy was always so fond of hearing about pretty clothes. "And now, my pet, tell me all about that interesting thing." Agnes had drawn up a chair to her little sister's side and taken Joy's hand in hers. They were very much alike, those two, although Agnes was 21 and Joy not even 11. Joy laughed her happy, affectionate little laugh and gave her sister's hand a loving squeeze. Yes, I will, but first I must begin at the beginning and tell you all about the day. Well, when you first left this morning, I made the bed and dusted the room as I always do, and watered my dear little geranium. There are 3 new buds on it. Isn't that nice? I was so pleased when I found them that I just danced. Then I studied my history real hard for ever so long. It was quite interesting too, all about Cromwell and the Commonwealth. Well, then it was pretty near lunchtime, so I washed my hands and brushed my hair, and as soon as the clock struck 1, I went downstairs. Lunch was very good today. There was a nice cold lamb and preserved plums. Mrs. Smith scolded and said the meat was tough, but nobody ever minds her. They were all very kind to me, and Mrs. Porter asked me questions about my books and said she would take me for a walk in Central Park someday when she wasn't too busy. Mrs. Smith wanted to know why you didn't send me to a blind school, and I told her it was because we couldn't either of us get on without the other, and that you taught me every evening. After lunch I came back here and did a little knitting. Then I played imaginary people come to call on me. First Miss Latimer came. You remember I told you about her. She is the very pretty young lady who goes to so many parties. And then Estelle Durant, and I made believe I gave them afternoon tea and little cream cakes with chocolate icing on them, and they told me about all the nice times they've been having. I was just in the middle of it and was really enjoying it very much when the interesting thing happened. All at once I heard someone calling out quite loud, little girl next door, open your window, I want to speak to you." I felt sure it must mean me, so I jumped up and opened my window, and sure enough, it was that little girl who lives next door. Don't you remember you told me about her last Sunday when we were coming in from church, and she was on her front steps with a gentleman? You said she had such nice soft hair you were sure I would like to feel it. She had been nodding and smiling at me, and when I wouldn't smile back she wanted to find out the reason why, so she opened her window and called out. Of course I explained things, and then she asked me to come over and play with her. I told her I couldn't go out by myself, and she wanted to know why my nurse couldn't bring me. I thought that was very funny, and I told her how old I was. But she didn't seem to think that made any difference, and said she knew people who were just as old as I am and have nurses just the same. She is nearly 10, and she has one, but she hasn't any mother, only a father. I was telling her about you and was just going to ask her her name when someone came to the window, I think it must have been her nurse, and scolded her for standing in the dampness. Then they both went away and shut the window, and I was so sorry, for I did want to find out what the little girl's name was. And was that all the adventure? Agnes asked, a little disappointed perhaps. Yes, that was all, but it was really quite interesting, don't you think so? Very soon after that it was 4 o'clock, and I knew I could read Little Lord Fauntleroy till you came home. I had been looking forward to that all day, for I knew I could have a good long read. You know, I am trying to make the story last just as long as I can, so I only allow myself to read 12 pages a day. But yesterday, just as I was beginning to read, Miss Scott came in, and she stayed so long that I only had time to read 3 pages before you came in, and that left 21 for today. Agnes stifled another sigh, and her fingers tightened lovingly over the little hand. How you do love reading, don't you, Joy? She said softly. Better than almost anything else in the world, especially reading with my fingers. If I could only buy you more books, the elder sister said, with a rather wistful glance around the small, shabbily furnished room. That is one reason I shall be so very happy if the publishers ever do take my book. It will be lovely when they do take it, said Joy enthusiastically. You mustn't keep all the money for me. You must buy lots of pretty clothes for yourself. And, oh, Aggie, do you suppose there would be enough left to pay for our going away to the country this summer? That would be so beautiful, wouldn't it? There must be money enough to pay for that, whatever happens, said Agnes, her face growing suddenly grave and troubled. I can't keep you in the hot city all summer again. You will be ill as you were last year. Oh, "Oh, no, I won't," said Joy brightly. "It will be lovely to go to the country if we can afford it, but if we can't, why, it won't matter. We can go to the park sometimes, and I can smell the flowers and hear the birds. That will be almost as good as the real country." There was a short pause. Joy nestled her head comfortably on her sister's shoulder, and Agnes slipped an arm around the little figure. Joy was the first to speak. "Aggie," she said abruptly, as though struck by a new idea, "haven't we got any relations?" The elder sister gave a slight start. "Relations? Why, no, dear, I don't think we have. That is, none nearer than second cousins. There is Cousin Julia Randolph. You remember her, don't you?" "Oh, yes, she was very kind to us when Papa died, and it was some friend of hers who knew Mrs. Winthrop and told her about you. But I wasn't thinking about Papa's people. I know he hadn't any near relations. I was wondering if Mama hadn't any." "What put that idea into your head?" Agnes inquired in some surprise. "It was something they said at lunch today. Miss Scott and Mrs. Oakley were talking about it." The color that Joy could not see rose in Agnes's cheeks, and she bit her lip with annoyance, but her voice was sweet and tender as it always was when she spoke to her little blind sister. "What were they saying?" "Well, Mrs. Oakley, you know she hasn't been here very long, and I think she must be a rather curious person, asked Miss Scott who took care of me when you were out, and when she said I took care of myself, Mrs. Oakley asked if we hadn't any other relations. Then Miss Scott told her all about us, how we used to live in the South and were rich until Papa died and all the money was lost. Mrs. Oakley said you didn't talk like most Southerners, and Miss Scott said she believed our mother came from the North. Then Mrs. Oakley asked what our mother's name was before she was married, because she said I looked something like a lady she knew long ago. And Miss Scott said she didn't know that, but she was sure anyone could see we came of a good family. And that was all, except that Mrs. Smith, who had been listening all the time, said it seemed rather queer that we shouldn't have any relations at all. She laughed in that funny way she does sometimes, and somehow it made me a little uncomfortable. And as I had finished my lunch, I came upstairs. But I couldn't help wondering whether we really did have any relations or not." Agnes was twisting one of Joy's long curls around her fingers. She was silent for a moment. Then she said slowly, "I will tell you all I know about Mama's people, Joy, but that isn't very much. You know, I was only 11 when she died, and I never heard Papa mention her family. But I remember that once when I was quite a little girl, she told me that her mother had died before she left home, and that she had never had any brothers or sisters. She was very, very fond of her father, and he was devoted to her until she did something that made him very angry, and after that he would never see her or speak to her again. It nearly broke her heart, but he was very firm and very obstinate, and so, though she knew he loved her all the time, he would never forgive her, and even sent her letters back unopened." Joy was leaning forward now, drinking in every word of her sister's story with almost breathless interest. "He must have been very cruel and very wicked," she said in a tone of conviction, "to treat his own daughter like that. But what had Mama done that he couldn't ever forgive?" Agnes hesitated. "Mama never told me exactly, but I think, indeed I am almost sure, he didn't like Papa." "Not like Papa? Oh, Aggie, how could that be? Papa was so good. Everybody loved him." "Well, you see, dear, Papa was a Southerner, and Mama's father hated the South. It was not very long after the war then, and people felt much more strongly on these subjects than they do now. Our grandfather had lost his only brother in the war. He died in a Southern prison. Papa had fought in the war too, you know, but on the other side. It was all very sad." Joy was silent for a moment. Then she said, "It was all very dreadful, but if Mama had only lived, I am sure her father would have forgiven her at last, and everything would have been all right. I wonder if he is alive now, and if he would like to know us." "I don't know, I'm sure," said Agnes, smiling. "He must be an old man now. He may be dead." "I wish we could find him," said Joy thoughtfully. "Why, my pet?" "Because I'm afraid he must be very lonely. You said he hadn't any other children except Mama, and perhaps most of his old friends are dead by this time. Then I think he must be very unhappy when he remembers how cruel and unkind he was." "You dear little tender-hearted girl," said Agnes, kissing her. "I believe that you would make the whole world happy if you could. But there is the clock striking 6, and I must hurry and dress, or I shall be late for dinner." Joy was unusually thoughtful that evening. She had very little to say at dinner, and even later when they had gone back to their room, and she had recited her history lesson and worked out some examples in arithmetic with Agnes's help, she had still very little to say. No further allusion, however, was made to the subject of the afternoon until Joy was in bed. And then, just as the elder sister was sitting down to do a little necessary mending before retiring herself, the child suddenly lifted her head from the pillow and inquired, "Aggie, what was Mama's name before she was married?" Agnes looked up with a start of surprise. "Still thinking about that?" said Agnes, laughing. "It seems a very strange thing to say, I suppose, but really, Joy, I don't know. You see, I was such a little girl when Mama died that she had never happened to mention it to me, and I always had a feeling that it was something Papa didn't like talking about, so I never asked him. I sometimes wish I had asked, though, for it seems so queer when people ask me not to be able to tell them my own grandfather's name." Joy gave a little sigh. "I don't suppose we could possibly find him then," she said. Agnes's eyes flashed, and her sweet face was a little hard as she answered, "I don't know that I should care to find him. He treated Mama and Papa very cruelly." "Yes, Aggie, I know, but you said Mama was sure he loved her all the time, and I know he must have been very unhappy afterward. I think he might be a little glad to find us, especially if he's very lonely. And I was just wondering if he wouldn't be proud of you when he heard how you paid all the debts after Papa died, even though there was so little money left. And Cousin Julia and all the rest said you were foolish. And I was wondering, too, if he wouldn't be just a little bit sorry when he knew how very hard you do have to work." End of chapter 2.